He's a usurper, and very soon he's a usurper who's also a regicide.
Henry now looks like a king, walks like a king. If it does both of those, then make it the king.
Henry is having to make live political decisions minute by minute for himself.
I mean, this wasn't the guy who sat around going, how can I seize the throne?
Everyone liked him. Wherever he went, he got on with people.
From 1377 to 1422, England's fortunes waxed and waned as three dramatically different men wore its crown. The deluded narcissist, Richard II, the charismatic usurper, Henry IV, and the lionised warrior, Henry V. In this three-part HistoryExtra podcast series, best-selling authors and historians Helen Castor and Dan Jones sat down to chart the reigns of these three rulers and explore how they shaped England, from the Peasants' Revolt to the Battle of Agincourt. Helen's new book, The Eagle in the Heart, follows the tangled stories of Richard II and Henry IV, while in his new book, Henry V, Dan Jones profiles the next king to sit on the throne. In this second episode, Helen and Dan delve into the turbulent life and reign of Henry Bolingbroke and explore how he became Henry IV.
At this point in English medieval history, we've had a dynasty, the Plantagenets, on the throne for quite some time. With Henry IV, we have a sort of subdivision of the Plantagenets, the Lancastrians. And that fact of the Duchy of Lancaster is incredibly important if you want to understand Henry IV's kingship. I wonder, can you explain to us where does Henry come from? Because he's not in the line to the throne, in fact, quite a long way from it when he's a child.
Yes, it's a complicated family tree at this point because King Edward III, Henry's grandfather and also Richard II's grandfather, who'd been king for 50 years in the middle of the 14th century, had had a lot of children, 12 children, of whom 6 made it to proper adulthood, 5 of whom were sons. Now, that's an embarrassment of riches, really. But the problem in the main line is that line comes to an abrupt and sticky end. The Black Prince, his oldest son, has one son, Richard II, who has no children and is deposed in 1399. Richard has seemed very unconcerned about having children. In fact, he doesn't seem to like the idea of having a clear heir because it's all about him. So there is a big question mark about who should properly be seen as his heir. Henry is the son of John of Gaunt, who is the third surviving son. So in the male line, Henry's there or thereabouts, but there is a complication. The second son, Lionel of Antwerp, one of the best medieval names, had only had a daughter. And that daughter, Philippa, had married the Earl of March, and her descendants, the Earls of March, who were all either called Roger or Edmund Mortimer, had potentially a claim to the throne that was better than the Lancastrian line. But when Richard was deposed in 1399, the practical fact of the matter was that the only possible replacement was Henry. He was the right age, he had the right skills, he was the one who was leading the resistance because it was his Duchy of Lancaster that Richard had seized illegally without justification. So he was the one who represented the grievances of the realm. And the Earl of March at this point is a small boy. So there is just no practical way that the claim of that senior but through the female line claim can be made real. But it means that Henry's reign starts out on a very wobbly foundation. Essentially, he's a usurper, and very soon he's a usurper who's also a regicide because you cannot have an ex-king hanging around the place, not even shut away in a castle, once it's become clear that rebellions might happen, and that happens within 3 months of him taking the throne. So he is king, but there are big question marks about his right and also about what he's had to do to get the crown for himself.
So here we have the Plantagenets proving Tolstoy's adage from Anna Karenina that all unhappy families are unhappy in their own particular way. This is rather a complicated way in which to be unhappy. Before we get to the very peculiar circumstances and complicated circumstances of Richard II's deposition, let's talk a little bit about a simpler time in Henry of Bolingbroke's life. He's born to John of Gaunt, third surviving son of Edward III. What kind of life do you think Henry had when he was a child? I mean, what do his prospects look like before Richard II's reign descends into turmoil and chaos?
The prospects are that he's going to be the greatest nobleman in his cousin's kingdom. At Richard's coronation, when they're both 10, because Henry is 3 months younger than Richard, so they're almost exactly of an age. At the coronation, at the feast after the coronation, his father, John of Gaunt, is busy with other duties, and Henry has to hold the ceremonial sword of state beside Richard's chair. So you have this wonderful image of these two 10-year-old boys, one wearing a crown and the other holding the ceremonial sword of state. And that really encapsulates what they should have grown up into. Henry should have been the greatest support, the greatest mainstay of his cousin's realm, his cousin's reign. And that's what Gaunt wanted for him. That's what he was prepared for and educated for. So when we look at Henry's childhood, we can't see many details. We don't have much specific information, but it is the standard education and upbringing of a great nobleman. He's taught to fight. He's taught to read in French and Latin. He's taught music. He's taught courtly manners. He's also at the heart of a great and magnificent household and a large and complicated family where Richard was the baby of a very unusual family and rather wrapped in cotton wool. Henry found himself in the middle of quite a rumbustious, active, very full household. He had two older sisters who were very formidable characters in their own right, and I like to imagine kept young Henry in his place and knocked some sharp edges off, perhaps. And his father, after Henry's mother died when he was only 17 months old, his father then had two new families going at the same time because he remarried Constanza of Castile, the heir to the Castilian throne. He also took a mistress, Catherine Swynford, who was his children's governess, and she also started having children. So the nursery's getting fuller and more crowded. Henry has a whole raft of siblings, half-siblings, step-siblings, because Catherine has some children from her first marriage. If this is sounding confusing, it's because it was a bit, but it meant that Henry had to learn how to get on with people. He had to learn what it was to lead a large and complicated household. And there's a real sense of strong characters having fun in the Lancastrian setup, which you don't get at all when you're looking at Richard.
It's inevitable, I suppose, to contrast. I mean, you do this brilliantly in your book, The Eagle and the Heart, about Richard and about Henry. And it, of course, because the dramatic shape of these two teenagers who grow up to become, royal rivals is so compelling. But they are really contrasting characters. Henry has this classically Western European noble upbringing, doesn't he? There's a moment, I mean, I know that because Henry doesn't grow up with the expectation that he's going to become king, lots of events in his childhood are not as well noted as they would have been otherwise. But there is a particularly perilous moment for him during the peasant revolt in London in 1381, isn't there? Which we know from a later record. He was right in the thick of this great rebellion.
He was. This is in a part of his life after Richard has become king at 10. In their early teens, there were efforts to put Henry and Richard together, to put Henry into Richard's household. We don't have a smoking gun, as it were. We don't have Richard writing in his diary, "I hate Henry and I wish he wasn't here." But there is a real sense that these two boys don't find anything to like about each other. They don't gel, they don't get on. But 1381 is one of those moments when Henry is in Richard's household in London, while his father, John of Gaunt, is right up on the Scottish border on diplomatic and military duty to try and hold that frontier against the Scots. So there Henry is in the Tower with Richard at the point when Richard rides out to Mile End for his first encounter with the men of Essex, the rebels that have come from Essex. And while he's out there, getting his first taste of the fact that the rebels revere him and they're looking to him for leadership and for redress of their grievances. Meanwhile, others among the rebels storm the tower. And Henry and the other members of the royal family and the other members of the royal household who are there find themselves in grave danger. And particularly Henry, because his father Gaunt was so hated. Gaunt's gorgeous palace of the Savoy outside London, the city of London to the west, has just been torched by the rebels. It's a smoking heap of rubble. So Henry's home has just gone up in flames. And we know, as you say, from a later record, that he is almost killed. While Richard is finding out that he pretty much is the Messiah in the eyes of the rebels, Henry almost dies at the age of 14, and he's only saved by a rebel named John Ferrer, who seems to have been a smallholder from Kent. And we know this happened because almost 20 years later, when Ferrer got involved in some later trouble in fact, what was the first year of Henry's reign as king, Henry pardoned him. And it says in the pardon that John Ferrer is being pardoned because he saved Henry's life in a wonderful and kind manner when the rebels overran the tower in 1381. So Henry knew how close he'd come to death, and he remembered the man who had saved him.
So he survives this really serious scrape in 1381 in the Tower of London during the Peasants' Revolt. Thereafter he becomes a relatively significant nobleman, even while his father, John of Gaunt, is alive. Let's talk about the Duchy of Lancaster, what it is. I mean, it may sound from the description like a sort of simple block of territory around the town of Lancaster in northwest England, but it's massively more than that, isn't it? I think there are 5 earldoms all clubbed together in one unit. I mean, you're the great expert on the Duchy of Lancaster, so
yes, and now you're going to ask me to name the earldoms.
I won't
but Leicester, Lincoln, and Derby, and I know. I mean, it's a huge noble inheritance that has come together over decades and decades and decades, and it has swathes of land and castles in the north, in the Welsh borders, in East Anglia, Sussex, the Midlands, the North Midlands in particular. I mean, it's quite hard really to find a county where Gaunt doesn't hold some land, and in some parts of the country, particularly the Yorkshire, the North, the Northwest, East Anglia, South Wales, he is overwhelmingly the preeminent power. Because with land goes not only money, but control over people. So Gaunt has this enormous, what's called an affinity. That is a huge network of lesser landowners and men who look to them in the localities, a huge retinue and networks beyond that of men he can call on for service in war if he needs them, but also in peacetime. So this is real power spread throughout the country. It's private power, it's power that he has as a subject of the king. And the idea is that when the kingdom is working well, that means it's power that's also at the disposal of the king himself if the king calls on Gaunt.
And it's also power that in some ways trickles down to the heir to the duchy in the form of Henry, to Henry Bolingbroke. By they say 5 years after the Peasants' Revolt, by the time we get to the mid-1380s, he's become a sort of live political player in England. And in the last episode of this mini-series, where we've been talking about Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, we talked about Richard. We talked about the great crisis of 1386, 87, 88. Henry Bolingbroke, to be Henry IV, is a key player in that first crisis of Richard II's reign, because he lines up with the Appellants, who are the noble opponents of the king, who try to drag Richard to some sort of semblance of order and good behaviour, unsuccessfully as it turns out. Why do you think he joins that movement? He
has been left in charge of his family's interests in England by his father Gaunt, who has gone off to Castile to try to win the crown that his wife has a claim to. That's a huge responsibility resting on this very young man's shoulders, Henry turns 20 in the spring of 1387. He's already married. His first son has been born to his young wife in 1386. His second son is then born in the autumn of 1387. So he's already an active part of this dynasty and of his family's future. And what the crisis that erupts in 1386 to 1387, what Richard is doing in trying to rewrite the law of treason, rewrite the relationship between the king and his law to the detriment, Henry thinks, of all his people, is a threat to his family. It's a threat to his dynasty. It's a threat to the kingdom as a whole. And there are further warning signs that seem to have precipitated him into action when Richard was on his travels during 1387, not cooperating with the regime that had been put in place in London to try to get a grip on the disaster that government had become. Richard is trying to recruit a military retinue of his own from scratch at this point, and he's doing it in areas that directly encroach on areas where the Lancastrian family are powerful in the northwest, because Richard holds the earldom of Chester, which is right next to Gaunt's Palatinate of Lancaster. That means an area where he has particular judicial privileges. And so this really looks like an attack on every level on Lancastrian interests and the wider realm as a whole. And I think Henry can't just find out what his father would want him to do. His father is hundreds of miles away in Spain. Henry is having to make live political decisions minute by minute for himself. And he commits himself with the other four appellants to trying to correct, trying to protect the realm from the danger into which Richard has pushed it. It's a dangerous decision to make. It's not sitting on the fence. It's a brave decision to take. And I do think it's understandable in terms of the kind of duty that Gaunt has inculcated in Henry. Gaunt has been very unpopular for years. People have said, oh, he's ambitious for himself. He wants to make himself king. He's a malign presence in the realm. But when you look at what Gaunt's been doing for years, it's duty. Yes, he's ambitious for his own family, but he's extraordinarily loyal. And he has not stopped moving for years in the attempt to hold this whole thing together. And I think Henry is doing his best to live up to the model that his father has shown him.
After the crisis of 86 through 88, let's call it that, Henry Bolingbroke sort of has the right idea, really, doesn't he? He sees what's happening in Richard's reign. He sees that things are really dysfunctional politically, constitutionally. The atmosphere around the king is poisonous. This is his cousin Richard, he knows of old, is not perhaps a man to be trusted or let alone liked. And he sort of gets the hell out of Dodge, doesn't he? He decides he's going to go off and do something else. And he has, I think, a kind of hinterland for a to-be English king, which is quite unusual, certainly in the later 14th century, and really matches up to a classical, and I mean that with a sort of small c, chivalric ideal of the later Middle Ages. He sort of goes off and becomes almost a knight errant, doesn't he?
He does. And for him, this is an absolute win-win. He's seen how much it has helped Gaunt to go off to Castile and come back 3 years later, welcomed by everyone because everything's fallen to pieces in his absence, and suddenly Richard's pleased to see him as well as everyone else. So the model of go away for a bit, let everything calm down, and it'll be easier when you come back, it already seems like a good one. Plus, he really wants to go because there's fun to be had, there's adventures to be had, there are experiences to be explored, there's a whole world out there, and Henry really makes the most of it. He knows he can leave because his dear wife, Mary, who seems to be a homebody, is making a wonderful home for them. She's pregnant again. They already have 2 sons. A third is born in 1389. She's pregnant yet again. So there are plenty of heirs. If something happens to Henry when he's away, unlike Richard, who is the only repository of sovereignty, Henry knows that he's already got 3 sons. It wouldn't be, he doesn't want to die, but if something bad happens, he's replaceable. There's a pause in the war with France, a series of short truces and everyone's tired of the war. And there's a real sense that people of Henry's caliber and status actually want to start to have some fun. And the first thing that happens in 1390 is a grand and glorious tournament in northern France, organised by 3 French knights led by the greatest of them all, a man named Jean Le Mangre, known as Boucicaut, who is barely older than Henry, but has already made the most glorious name for himself. First into battle at the age of 12, he is known to be said to be the greatest knight in Europe. He can more or less do backflips in his armour. He's short, but he can get into the saddle in his armour without putting his foot in the stirrup. His exploits are being talked about all over Europe, and Henry goes to meet him in the lists and makes his name. Of all the English contingent who go, and there are lots of them, including Harry Percy, Hotspur, whose name is still famous now, but it's Henry who becomes the star. And this gives him a taste for more. He makes friends with Boucicaut. The two of them get on like a house on fire. And his initial plan is to go on crusade south to North Africa with Boucicaut, but the King of France isn't too keen on him riding through. Yes, there's a truce, but Henry of Bolingbroke riding at the head of armed men through France doesn't sound like a great idea. So instead, he goes to the Baltic. He organises a troop of friends and servants and knights and takes off in a couple of extremely well-equipped ships to go and fight the pagans of Lithuania with the Teutonic knights who rule in Prussia. Has a whale of a time there too, gets to the walls of Vilnius, doesn't quite manage to force his way into Vilnius, comes back to Königsberg where they spend the winter. He hears about the birth of his 4th son. They carouse and have great fun, comes home, decides he wants to go again, tries going back to Prussia. The weather's too bad. There isn't going to be an expedition that year. So he decides he's going to go on as a pilgrim in peace through the courts of Europe to Jerusalem. And he gets to Jerusalem, where even Richard the Lionheart, even the great crusading king, Edward I, didn't set foot. Henry's going not as a crusader, but as a pilgrim, but he sees the Holy Sepulchre. He sees the great sights of Christianity, and then comes back, having gone out via Venice, he comes back via Venice and again through the great courts of Europe, and he's fated wherever he goes and turns up back at Peterborough to meet his little family again for the first time, bringing with him a parrot for Mary, an ostrich he's been given in Bohemia, what's usually said to be a leopard, but I'm convinced is a cheetah, a hunting cheetah that he's been given by the King of Cyprus. And you can just imagine what Mary must have thought seeing this procession come down the drive. Oh God, what's he brought now? He is the most glamorous figure. His outfits are magnificent. His motto is "Souvenez-vous de moi," remember me, which is the French for forget-me-not. So he has these gorgeous outfits with forget-me-nots trailing, embroidered across them, and silver leaves and embroidered mottos. He is one of the most glamorous figures in Europe, and it makes him sound bland when I say this, but everyone liked him. Wherever he went, he got on with people. He had his friends around him who he was also able to lead, some of them people seconded from his father's household, who in a way you might have expected to be slightly paternal figures. But this was a bonded group of friends, of men who answered his command. We have to think of him as one of the most famous knights in Christendom. Yeah,
in a sense, there's sort of the paragon of chivalry, the Platonic ideal of the late medieval nobleman with this sort of grand European outlook, this sort of ability in the saddle, this easy way with other men. This, the records of the gifts he sends to Mary, his wife, are very touching. It's not just turning up with a parrot, which she loved, and a leopard. It's musical instruments. It's gifts of fish. It's a thoughtfulness that seems to pervade him.
He's a thoughtful man and a very, very cultured man. This is among the things that he and Mary had in common, they loved books, they loved music, they played music together, they listened to music together, they both composed music. He was a patron of poets, the poet John Gower. There's a point in the early 1390s where John Gower, who's a friend of Chaucer, lives in London, and he's written a great long poem called the Confessio Amantis. Despite its Latin title, it's in English, which he's originally dedicated to Richard. And there's a point after Richard's great punitive falling out with the City of London where John Gower goes, scrubs out the dedication to Richard and rededicates it to Henry. Not entirely sure how that goes down with Richard, but there's a sense that, yes, he's a chivalric knight in the fullest sense. He's not just a sort of licensed thug enjoying beating up other licensed thugs. He is a man of real culture and intelligence and thoughtfulness.
Yet no matter how cultured, intelligent and thoughtful one is, there's no escaping Richard II if you're in England in the 1390s. And as listeners will know from Shakespeare, it's the end of the 1390s when Richard's so-called tyranny begins in 1397 that things start to become very, very complicated for Henry Bolingbroke. Now, he's made a duke, isn't he, by Richard? He seems to, of the five rebels, the Appellants of the 1387-88, two of them seem to manage to steer clear of trouble initially when it breaks out in 1397, he and Thomas Mowbray, and they're given ducal titles as Richard kind of appears at least to draw them into the fold. And yet then, within a year of the crisis breaking out, both of these two men have been exiled. It's such a puzzling episode, as well as the great drama of judicial trial at Coventry and the exiles. What is going on? I mean, we've discussed already what's going on in the mind of Richard II, which is mostly a sort of a mirror on his own image, which he fawns over. But what's going on for Henry at this point?
I suspect a lot of internal despair, because this is such a complicated and horrifying position to find himself in. Richard has made it clear that he is going to go after the three senior appellants, the most powerful of whom is, after all, Henry's uncle, Richard's uncle too, Thomas of Woodstock. And actually the Earl of Arundel is his wife Mary's maternal uncle. So these are men that he's intimately connected with and had stood beside during the crisis of 1387 to 1388. But his father Gaunt has decided that in this moment of choice, they will support Richard. Gaunt hadn't been there in 1387 to 1388. If Richard is going to take his revenge, then the House of Lancaster this time will stand with the king. And that means not only standing by, but taking part in the destruction of those lords. Henry has to testify against Arundel in Parliament. In so doing, he has to sort of allude to the fact that he'd been involved. But in that trial, there's a very careful line drawn through that narrative to try and make clear why Henry and Mowbray are being left aside at this point. Mowbray's position is even worse because he's captain of Calais. He's the one responsible for Woodstock's murder there. So they are both in this intensely precarious and dangerous position, which means that when that destruction has taken place and the dust is beginning to settle, they are left in a state of panic and terror, and they don't trust each other. And it's Mowbray who breaks first, comes to see Henry, catches him on the road at Brentford outside London and says, "We're about to be undone. The king is going to take revenge for what we did." And Henry has no idea whether this is real or whether it's a trap, whether Richard has sent Mowbray to entrap Henry or whether Mowbray is actually telling the truth. All Henry can think of to do is ask his father what to do, so he goes to see Gaunt, who goes to see Richard, because as far as Gaunt's concerned, the only safety lies in bringing the whole thing into the open. Essentially, therefore, Mowbray and Henry are accusing each other of treason. What's then going to happen? Richard says, "Okay, fight a duel. God will sort out who's telling the truth." This great event is set up, this trial by combat at Coventry in 1398, and months to wait till this happens. So Henry has this terrible time travelling round his father's estates, collecting the finest armour he can send for from his friend, the Duke of Milan, who he's met on his travels, preparing for a moment in which he might lose his life. His whole future is going to turn on combat in horrifying reality for the first time. People are coming from all over Europe to watch this duel take place. In the moment, finally, they step forward into the lists. In his Milanese armour, Mowbray's wearing German armour. They've prepared for months, and Richard says, stop. Because who can read Richard's mind? But it seems as though Richard has suddenly realised that letting this fight go ahead may not actually give him the result he wants. One is going to kill the other, presumably, which means that one is destroyed, great, but the other one then has God's blessing and is restored to his place at Richard's side, and Richard doesn't really want that for either of them. If Richard stops the fight, he can exile them both. Henry has to leave everything, has to leave his family, has to leave his ageing father, has to leave his home. Again, this time not of his own volition. He goes to Paris in exile. Mowbray goes off to the Holy Land, and that is when his father dies and Richard's revenge is unleashed, and he takes the Duchy of Lancaster for himself.
And as we heard in the last episode when we were discussing Richard II, this is a fatal miscalculation of Richard's, which draws Henry inevitably back from Paris to claim the Duchy of Lancaster, and support for Richard completely melts away. And again, not much of a surprise looking back on it to anybody except for Richard II himself. But then we come to the great drama of 1399, a sort of pivot point in the whole of Plantagenet history, really, when this decision has to be made to depose, it's confected as an abdication, but to depose a ruling king and install somebody who is not completely obviously the natural heir. There'd been the deposition of Edward II, 1327 to 28, but he was replaced by Edward III, who was his eldest son and unquestionably the next in line to the throne.
So the waters can close over Edward II's head and everyone can pretend it never happened.
Right.
In this case, it's completely different. And so that there is this, firstly, they have to decide who is going to be the king. I think that's probably the easiest of the decisions, isn't it? Because, as you've so eloquently described, Henry Bolingbroke, Henry now Duke of Lancaster, looks like a king, walks like a king. If it does both of those, then make it the king. But there is this very, very perplexing question of how do we frame this? How do we do this? And how do we do this without a raft of terrible, unseen, unpredictable consequences for the whole of kingship going forward? The solution, actually, in 99 is fairly elegantly pulled off insofar as the circumstances will allow, isn't it? It is. There's a parliament held at Westminster, ironically, the first parliament held in Richard's beautifully remodelled Westminster Hall after the work has been finished, and it's the parliament that deposes him. Once it has been declared that Richard is deposed, it is technically no longer a parliament because it was Richard's authority that had summoned it, technically. The throne sits empty before the assembly. Henry is sitting there as Duke of Lancaster. He then steps forward and makes a short speech. And what he says is that he challenges the realm of England, meaning he lays claim to the realm of England. And he makes this speech in English, which is really significant because normally the language of politics at this point is still just about French, courtly French, and the records of it are all written in Latin, and sometimes Latin is still being spoken. So to have a king, or not yet a king, to have someone stand up and lay his claim to the realm of England in English is a very deftly handled thing. And what he essentially said, he sort of alludes in three directions. He is descended from the great king Henry III. The Lancastrian line goes all the way back. And there have been stories, myths that actually the Lancastrian line is descended from someone who should have been the elder son but had a hunchback, and so what, it's all nonsense. But anyway, he alludes to the fact that in the male line he goes all the way back through centuries, the royal bloodline. He also, in a sense, he's taken over England he's raised his banner. He hasn't actually had to raise his sword. Can he take the throne by right of conquest? Well, the problem there is he could rewrite the law if he's conquered the land, and no one wants him to do that. He's come back to defend the law, not to... Then the other possibility is acclamation, that the Parliament, the people of England could acclaim him their king, but that would somehow suggest that power is coming upwards from the people instead of down from God. And again, Henry doesn't want that. So there are gestures towards all of those things in his speech. But basically he just says, I am the rightful king. And everyone says, yes.
Okay.
Yes, you are. And then he has himself crowned. And at that point, he too is an anointed king, blessed by God. The ceremonial is all in place. Richard has abdicated. No one's seeing him anymore. He's behind closed doors. Will the waters close over Richard's head now? And will it be possible for everyone to pretend that this is always how it was supposed to be?
And the answer, of course, and really the whole narrative of Henry IV's reign is no. The problems of a usurper are unique and very, very difficult, perhaps even intractable. I mean, I suppose the first question, the burning question that arises in Henry's reign is, what do you do about Richard? Because you can't unanoint a king. I mean, you can kick him off the throne, but Richard had taken off to Pontefract Castle, weeping and gnashing his teeth and wishing he'd never been born, and going out the same way he came in, effectively.
Exactly.
Couldn't be more Richard. But here's a problem. What do you do? I mean, we know what had happened to Edward II, which was bumped off. I mean, the same problem then arises with Richard.
It does, and significantly, because this is a pattern that recurs, it happened with Edward II and it will recur again in the 15th century, it's the first time any hint of rebellion in the name of the deposed king rears its head. The choice then becomes inevitable. Henry and his new council have already said Richard must stay at Pontefract, no one must see him, he must be served by people who have never served him before, he must disappear into the darkness, really. Oblivion must claim him. But in January 1400, at the Feast of the Epiphany, which is Richard's 33rd birthday, the four of the noblemen who were closest to Richard, who have lost most and are most frightened for their future under the new regime, decide it's too much of a risk to run and they are going to launch a rebellion. The rebellion is betrayed to Henry before it can even get going by another of the noblemen who had been absolutely closest to Richard, his cousin, Henry's cousin, Edward of Rutland. So it's a rebellion that doesn't even really get started. And actually the rebel lords are murdered horribly by angry mobs wherever they show their faces. But the writing's on the wall. And in February 1400, the council have a meeting at which the minute records a rather strange note. The council say, if Richard is still alive, as it is supposed that he is, then he should be guarded really, really, really carefully. But if he's dead, then his face should be shown to the people so that everyone should know he was dead. And a week later, news comes that who knew? He actually is dead. It's not clear how he died, but rumours were circulating that he had starved to death, whether because he was languishing in despair and refused to eat, or much more likely had been not given food and drink until nature took its course.
But even with Richard gone and Richard shown in public, I mean, not buried where he wanted to be buried,
not in his glamorous
tomb, but at King's Langley. Even at that point, the problems of a usurper won't go away, will they? Because having taken the throne, Henry is now in this perilous position where he's indebted to the people who helped him do it. And really the first very serious rebellion of his reign, which isn't foiled in advance and has to be taken all the way through to test on the battlefield, comes with the Percys in the north. This is symptomatic, isn't it, of the problems every usurper will always face, which is how do you balance becoming a king with needing to reward the people who made you a king?
That's it. Henry had hoped that ruling well would start, instead of vicious spiral that Richard had created with his paranoia and his megalomania, he will start a virtuous circle by ruling well, and then people will give him their loyalty. But it's very, very difficult because he's got problems on all sides. A rebellion has popped up in Wales. Owen Glendower has seized the moment to try and launch a campaign for an independent Wales. The French are not happy that the king who was married to their little princess has been bumped off the throne. They think this is a terrible thing to do. The Scots are threatening to pour over the northern border. Henry desperately needs money. The people in England think he's promised not to take any taxation, because he's going to be a much better king than Richard, and because he's got the huge Duchy of Lancaster, so he's got a private income. Why would he need to take taxes from them? But he's got to take taxes because he's already paying almost all the income of the Duchy of Lancaster to his retainers, who he needs as his army to help him stay on the throne. And then, as you say, the Percys are holding the north for him. He's given them lots and lots of rewards, but how much reward is enough for kingmakers, particularly kingmakers who are being stretched thin themselves on every front, trying to hold the north, trying to hold Wales, having to pay for all of that out of their own pockets. And in 1403, Hotspur has had enough. And at Shrewsbury, in the summer of 1403, Hotspur, in Cheshire, he declares for what we know is the ghost of Richard, but people are prepared to believe is a king they can still rally behind, a dead king walking. And outside Shrewsbury, two big armies end up facing one against the other, a pitched battle between English armies on English soil. This is really dangerous, really serious stuff.
But Henry, of course, I mean, it still has, despite being a usurper, he has a huge new raft of problems facing him, but he does still have many of the attributes that made him such a good candidate for kingship in the first place, which is, although he hasn't fought a battle before, he has been on crusade and he's fought in the list. I mean, he's physically an active and adept king, and triumphs at Shrewsbury, and the Percys are butchered, and I mean, it takes a while to properly deal with the Percys, but certainly Hotspur ends up in bits, as does Thomas Percy, Earl of Worcester. So Henry IV seems to have this remarkable ability to just ride out crisis after crisis, which is fortunate because that's what his reign becomes. Crisis after crisis after crisis, which is made worse in 1405 when the first signs of serious ill health start to creep up on him. There are many ironies in the reign of Henry IV, but one of them seems to be that this kind of beautiful, manly, handsome, energetic, physically adept person begins to suffer the most appalling physical decline. Can we trace it to there's a crisis in 1405, a rebellion in the north, and I think in retrospect a lot of people will say that this decline in Henry IV's health is punishment for what he does in 1405.
Yes, this is a very unlikely rebellion. It seems to should really have been a proper Percy rebellion, but actually the Percys don't end up at the forefront, or the remaining Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, doesn't end up at the forefront of it. It breaks out in Yorkshire, led by the previous Thomas Mowbray, who's now dead, has a teenage son who's not happy with where his dynasty has ended up, and the Archbishop of York, the least likely pair of rebel leaders you can find. And Henry is so at the end of his tether that when he crushes this rebellion, which he does, absolutely crushes it underfoot, he has them both executed. But having an archbishop executed after what is a very summary trial is not something that England has seen before. The last time an archbishop was killed by a king was Thomas Becket, with some ill-chosen words by Henry II. This is a major decision to take, which he does in the heat of the moment. And when he falls ill in the year thereafter, people are very, very quick to say, this is God's punishment. Henry resists that interpretation, but privately, it's very hard when you add that up to the stack of other things he's had to do. Looking Richard's murder, the taking of the crown, his complicity in the murder of his uncle Thomas of Woods. You go as far back as you can, and there's a stack of things that Henry has had to do, and there's a real sense that he is haunted. He
Yes.
is haunted by what he's done.
And one gets the impression that as his life goes on, he suddenly becomes, or he's never irreligious by any stretch of the imagination, but his devotion to the Trinity, his not obsession, but his fondness for particular holy men, particularly John Bridlington, these seem to ramp up and up and up, possibly in tandem with the decline of his health. But he seems to become more and more tormented by what he's had to do. Not necessarily out of personal ambition. I mean, this wasn't a guy who sat around going, how can I seize the throne? It's like this has just become the consequence of one thing after another. And now he's weighed down. He feels physically burdened by the consequences of his own actions, which I suppose is what makes him such a wonderful Shakespearean character of a totally different
and such
sort.
an appealing character in human terms, I think. And among the things that he has done, of course, is he's changed not only his own life, but that of his entire family, including his 4 sons, who, given that the oldest 2, Henry and Thomas, were born just as the crisis of 1386 to 88 was getting going. And the fact that Thomas is called Thomas, and he's born in 1387, just at the point when some key personnel of that crisis on the side that are standing up to Richard are all called Thomas, as is the great forebear Thomas of Lancaster, who stood up to Edward II. It feels as though that's Thomas's very name is an indication of the choices that Henry has had to make. But of course, this is where the book that you've just written, your very brilliant study of Henry V, comes in, because these events that we're talking about in the whole of Henry IV's reign, you're looking at from a different point of view, because you're looking at them from the point of view of Henry's eldest son, another Henry, who, while my Henry, as I now think of him, is dealing with that sense of guilt and that sense of torment and the horrible decline of his own health, it's the Prince of Wales who has to step up, and his perspective on what I'm sounding quite sympathetic to is a bit different, isn't it?
It is different, and I think that we're going to have an episode where we discuss Henry V, and I think that natural difference in the position of these 2 Henrys, one the usurper, one the rightful heir, really drives so much to the heart of medieval kingship, late medieval kingship. Certainly for Henry V, the opportunities that are presented, as well as the one of which is the opportunity to have an apprenticeship during his father's reign, and to have a difficult apprenticeship which teaches him a lot, will become invaluable to him as king. That is cold comfort, I'm sure, to his father, Henry IV, who is, after 1405 and certainly 06, 07, his health is failing him. The crises aren't going away. Kingship doesn't just pause because you feel poorly or because you've got the sort of problems of usurpation. Events move on and become increasingly challenging. I wonder, on Henry IV, do you have any theories about what was wrong with Henry IV? Because when he first falls ill, contemporaries who have quite a small number of catch-all medical descriptions say, it's leprosy because something's amiss with his skin. Clearly, it's not the disease that today is known as Hansen's disease. There seem to be a number of different health problems, circulatory issues. What do you think?
There are a number of things going wrong. Perhaps we should say that we know it isn't Hansen's disease in part because his tomb was later opened partially in the 19th century and his nose cartilage was intact for a brief moment before it crumbled away, which suggests that it wasn't Hansen's disease. Almost the only thing that we know for certain from contemporary sources, he was afflicted with a rectal prolapse, because we know he was treated for that, which sounds particularly unpleasant, but that cannot have been all it was. He certainly had problems with his skin, may have been some sort of psoriasis, some other festering of the flesh, Adamus calls it, and he may have had difficult circulatory problems, perhaps a blood clot in his leg. The first big attack that he has in 1406 is a problem with his leg where he can't ride. So it is a general breakdown in his health, but mentally he's absolutely fine. This is not like what's happening in France, which is highly relevant to our story, where since 1392, the King of France, Charles VI, has been suffering intermittent bouts of madness or mental collapse. It's not that problem. Henry is still all there, albeit that he's sometimes rather more preoccupied with the fate of his soul in the next world than he is with what's going on in his country at present. But it's a difficult thing then to work out how to run government when the king's stamina and the king's focus is not reliable. And it also has to be said, again, thinking of the difference between your Henry's apprenticeship and mine, one of the big problems that Henry IV has when coming to the throne is that he has had a very detailed apprenticeship, but it's been an apprenticeship to be Duke of Lancaster. It hasn't been about running the whole country. And the one thing that he's never had to tangle with is being short of money. His father was extraordinarily rich and became richer when he came back from Castile because he'd essentially been paid off. He came back with a huge lump sum and a vast annual pension for the rest of his life. So Henry's been able to gad about Europe knowing that Gaunt will forward money to the Italian bankers in Venice or Florence or wherever he is, whenever he needs it. So the idea of economizing, which is what Henry has to do throughout his reign, and getting a real grip on royal finances in a situation where the people whose loyalty he can really rely on, his Duchy of Lancaster men, are all also in new jobs because they've never run the government before either. That's a perennial problem for him. And so in the later years of his reign, there are periodic attempts to put a council in place that can get a better grip on finances and on the war effort, whether it's financing Calais, whether it's making sure that Wales is properly subdued, and can do so in those moments when the king himself really can't focus.
One of the great lessons of certainly, I think, late medieval kingship is that managerialism can only take you so far. And maybe this is a broader historical truth, that really there's something about the physical person of the king that is the core of confidence in the institution of monarchy, in the polity in general. And what I think you see as Henry IV's reign goes on, through no fault of his own, through the welter of problems that face England anyway, that are unique to the usurpation and that are germane to his health. The combination of these, he almost disappears from the centre of politics as this great figure, and at times you sense this the political gravity moving towards his son and heir, Prince Henry, to be Henry V. But that can never truly land upon him until he becomes king, which is why I think as Henry IV's illness progresses, there starts to be this sort of whispered talk of, well, maybe we just ask the old guy to resign. There is this sense that maybe the best thing would be to accelerate the transition from king to king.
And of course, they have an immediate example. I mean, those who are thinking in that managerial way, led principally by the very frustrated Prince of Wales, who's thinking, come on already. The example of Richard's deposition, which was justified in terms of him not being adequate to rule the country. That was the kind of line that was, long articles describing all the terrible things he'd done. But the bottom line was he not adequate to rule the country. Now, this is a different kind of inadequacy, but surely is it not comparable? No, it is not, Henry IV says. There are no circumstances under which he is going to allow his kingship to be put in the same category, even remotely, as his cousin. The idea that he should be shuffled off and sent into retirement, he will not have it. And in 1411, there is this moment where it seems, we don't have many details, it's a couple of lines in a chronicle, clearly it's not something that was put into the parliamentary record, but that the Prince of Wales and his uncle, one of Henry's half-brothers, Henry Beaufort, the Bishop of Winchester, go to see him, and they make this very pragmatic suggestion. And Henry's not having it. And Henry goes straight back into Parliament and says, right, I'm in charge, no novelties. Thank you, my council. You've done diligent work. I'm very grateful. And you're dismissed.
And you can look at this moment when Henry IV refuses to give up power as incredibly selfish, but there's another way in which it's self-sacrificial, isn't it? It's saying this is the right way to do things, and this is incredibly physically painful to Henry to have to do it. He dies with guilt on his conscience in 1413, imagining he's in Jerusalem, somehow going home to perhaps a place where he's happiest. But the rest of the story, I think, belongs to to Henry V. So it is there we will leave this episode, and in the next episode we will be discussing Henry V. Helen, thank you very much.
Thank you.